What if your thoughts were never yours to begin with? What if, long before you had a voice, someone else was already speaking through you? Before you could walk, before you could say no, the world had already begun shaping the person you would have to become, and the one you would be punished for being. Your mind, before it was yours, was hers, not consciously, not with malice, but with incredible power, because when you were a child, you were not just loved, you were molded. Every glance of disappointment, every flash of approval, every silence when you cried, was programming. You learned quickly what to say to be held, what not to feel to be accepted, what to hide to stay safe. And you obeyed, not out of weakness, but out of pure survival. Carl Jung did not call this abuse. He called it something worse, unconscious inheritance. It's when the unlived pain, fear, and identity of your mother seeps into you, not through words, but through presence. You don't get to choose it, you just become it. And now, you call those thoughts yours. You call that voice in your head you. But what if the reason you feel trapped, lost, anxious, is because the person living your life was built for someone else's story? What if you're not broken, but programmed? And what if the first step to healing is not learning something new, but unlearning what was never yours? You don't remember the moment it happened because you were not supposed to. By the time you could form a memory, your mind had already been written on, not by choice, by proximity. A child does not learn by logic. A child becomes what they are exposed to. Before you understood words, you absorbed emotions. You learned what was safe and what would cost you love. If she was anxious, you learned to scan the room. If she was distant, you learned to perform. If she was controlling, you learned to shrink. And if she was hurt, you learned to become her healer. Not because you wanted to, because your survival depended on it. Carl Jung called this the mother archetype, a universal psychic blueprint, the most powerful emotional force in a child's early life. But he did not describe her as a person. He described her as a field of influence, a presence that silently molds the child's emotional structure through thousands of small, invisible moments. And here's the terrifying part. The child does not know this is happening. You did not know that guilt could be learned, that shame could be inherited, that fear could become your inner compass, all before you could spell your name. And because she loved you, you trusted her. And because you trusted her, you never questioned the code she planted. You assumed it was truth. So when you learned to sit still, be quiet, please others, say sorry, you thought it was maturity. But it was fear, fear of rejection, fear of losing her gaze, fear of losing her. You became hyper-aware. You learned to read her silence like a warning. You edited your words before you spoke. You smiled when you were hurt. You said, "It's okay," when it was not. All of this, before you ever made a single conscious decision. And now, as an adult, you wonder why you can't say no without guilt, why you overthink simple messages, why your nervous system activates before your mind understands what's wrong. It's because you were not just raised, you were programmed. You inherited her emotional DNA, not just through genes, but through moments, through tones, through glances, through the unbearable weight of her unmet expectations. She did not need to punish you. She only needed to withdraw. And you, desperate not to lose love, became exactly what she needed you to be. This was not parenting. It was encoding. It was the invisible blueprint. And like any blueprint, you are still building your life on it, whether you realize it or not. She did not teach you how to think. She taught you what to fear. And what you fear still rules you. You fear disappointing people. You fear being misunderstood. You fear being fully seen, because as a child, being seen often meant being corrected. So now, as an adult, you wear masks. You overperform. You collapse your needs to make others feel comfortable. And all of it started before you had a name for it. That's the power of maternal imprinting. That's the invisible blueprint. Not because she was evil, but because she too was built from blueprints she never saw. But what happens when you finally see it? What happens when you realize your entire sense of self was crafted to survive her emotional weather? You begin to unlearn, and in that unlearning, you begin to breathe for the very first time. A child will do anything to keep love, even if it means disappearing, and that's exactly what happens. Not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece. It starts with small moments. You cry, and she looks away. You get angry, and she tightens. You ask too many questions, and she sighs. You learn, some parts of me are allowed, and some are not. So you begin to hide them. You don't stop feeling, you just bury it. You don't stop needing, you just silence the need. You don't stop existing, you just fracture. And the part of you that remains? That's the version that survived. That's the mask you learned to wear. Carl Jung called it the persona, the socially acceptable version of you, the role you performed to avoid pain, to win approval, to stay safe in the gaze of the mother. But here's what he knew that most people don't. The persona is not you. It's a disguise, a survival suit, a carefully crafted imitation of who you had to be. Behind it lives what Jung called the shadow, the parts you disowned, suppressed, rejected, exiled, your anger, your wildness, your defiance, your voice, all pushed down to make room for a version of you that wouldn't trigger her. Because when you were a child, love wasn't unconditional. Love had rules, it had moods, it had invisible contracts, so you signed them. You became the pleaser, always agreeable, always apologizing. You became the fixer, always scanning for problems to solve. You became the perfect child, high-performing, self-sacrificing, silently drowning. And each time you stepped into one of those roles, you stepped further away from yourself. These weren't personalities. They were defense mechanisms, costumes, cages. You laughed when you wanted to scream. You smiled when you were breaking. You offered help when you needed it most. And they praised you for it, called you mature, said you were so well behaved. But they didn't know they were applauding your disappearance. Because here's the tragic truth. No one sees the child who hides well. And over time, the performance becomes permanent. You forget it's a mask. You forget there's even a self beneath it. You become what others need. You lose what you need. And deep down, a part of you whispers, "This isn't me. This has never been me." But you silence it. Because that voice, your real voice, has always cost you something. And even now, as an adult, you still fear that cost. You still hesitate to speak your truth. You still calculate your worth based on what others expect. You still feel guilty for simply existing as you are. Because when love was conditional, authenticity became dangerous. And so, you split. One part of you lived in the light, pleasing, pleasing, pleasing. The other lived underground, rejected, unclaimed, starving for air. But no split lasts forever. Eventually, the buried self begins to leak. Through anxiety, through rage, through addiction, through depression, and you wonder why. You wonder where it's coming from. You ask yourself, why do I feel like I'm performing all the time? Why do I feel fake, empty, disconnected? The answer? Because you're still living as the child who had to survive, not as the person who's finally free to exist. The child survives by becoming what the mother needs, not what they are. And now it's time to ask, who are you when you're no longer surviving? Because the longer you wear the mask, the more distant the real you becomes. But that version, the buried one, it hasn't died. It's waiting for the moment you finally say, I don't want to be loved for who I pretend to be. I want to be seen, even if it means being misunderstood. I want to be whole, even if it means being alone. I want to be real, even if it costs me everything I built to be safe. Because safety is not the same as freedom. And if you're ready to be free, you have to meet the part of you left behind to survive. The child you buried did not die. They just went underground. And what lives in the dark does not stay silent. This is where Jung's shadow begins. Not in evil, not in darkness, but in rejection. Every time you silenced a feeling to stay loved. Every time you abandoned your need to keep the peace. Every time you became who she wanted instead of who you were, you carved off a piece of yourself and locked it away. At first, it seemed like a fair trade. Love in exchange for silence. Safety in exchange for self. But nothing stays buried forever. The anger you weren't allowed to express becomes passive aggression. The needs you were told were too much become addiction. The voice you weren't allowed to use turns into anxiety, tension, dissociation. And worst of all, you blame yourself. You wonder why you feel too sensitive, too intense, too needy, too ashamed, too exhausted, too angry. But What you're really feeling is the return of everything you had to deny. That is the shadow. And the longer you repress it, the louder it knocks. Because the shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits, it gathers weight, it learns your patterns. And then, it starts to live through them. Suddenly you're sabotaging relationships, pushing people away, attracting chaos, avoiding peace, fearing intimacy, needing validation from people who remind you of her. You tell yourself you're broken, but you're not. You're just haunted by the version of you that never got to live. Don't upset her. Be who she loved. Be good. Be small. Don't be too much. These voices sound like your thoughts, but they're not. They're echoes of programming, scripts written by fear. And here's what Jung warned us. What you resist not only persists, it grows stronger. You were never resisting yourself. You were resisting the shadow, the part of you that remembers the truth you weren't allowed to speak. And now, you feel like you're fighting yourself, but you're not. You're fighting the version she built, the you that was engineered to keep her comfortable, to protect her emotions, to absorb her projections, to fulfill her dreams, to never ask for too much, to always put her first. But that version, it's not you. It's a survival algorithm, crafted by love, conditioned by fear. And yet, you still obey it. You hear your own needs and silence them. You feel your boundaries and override them. You know you're exhausted but push through anyway, because you still think worth is earned through sacrifice. You inherited her guilt, her shame, her self-rejection, and now you wear it like it's yours. But it never was. This is the war within you, the internal battle between who you are and who you became to survive her. It's why love feels unsafe, why rest feels lazy, why truth feels like betrayal, because every time you try to be whole, you awaken the parts of you she trained you to fear. But let's be clear, you're not fighting your mother. You're fighting the version of yourself that she built to keep you acceptable. And the scariest part of healing is realizing that to become real, you'll have to disappoint that version. You'll have to disappoint her. You'll have to say, I'm not your reflection. I'm not your redeemer. I'm not your second chance. You'll have to reclaim your anger, not to hurt her, but to protect yourself. You'll have to let yourself need things, not because you're weak, but because you're human. You'll have to let go of perfection, not because you failed, but because it was never your job to save her. This is not rebellion. This is restoration. The shadow she created isn't your enemy. It's your signal. It's the part of you that remembers who you were before you split in two. It carries your fire, your clarity, your truth. And healing begins the moment you stop apologizing for your own return. Because there's a version of you that existed before you were edited. And that version, that's the real you. And no matter how buried, how disguised, how disconnected, it's still there, waiting. Waiting for the day you finally say, I'm done fighting a war I never started, and I'm ready to meet the self she never got to see. You think the past is over, but it is not. It lives in your choices, in your tone, in your silence. It lives in the way you flinch when someone raises their voice, in the way you soften your truth to keep others calm, in the way you love people who cannot love you back. You call it a pattern, but it's not just a pattern. It's a ghost. The ghost of someone you had to become to survive her. What she did not say, what she withheld, what she made you feel without words, you now carry in every room you walk into. And it shows up everywhere, in relationships where you overextend, in friendships where you betray yourself, in conversations where you smile while bleeding. You think you're being kind, but really you're just avoiding abandonment. You think you're being mature, but you're actually performing peace so you don't get punished for being real. This is self-abandonment, the reflex to abandon yourself before anyone else gets the chance. Because long ago, you learned, if you upset her, you lose love. So now, you avoid conflict like it's a crime. You say, I'm fine when you're crumbling. You make excuses for their behavior. You take responsibility for everyone's emotions except your own. And somewhere, deep inside, a voice whispers, I don't even know who I am anymore. You've spent so long trying to be safe, trying to be enough, trying to be what others expect, that the real you feels like a distant stranger. That is the cost of unconscious programming, and Carl Jung warned us about it. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you will call it fate. You think it's fate that you keep falling for people who won't choose you. You think it's coincidence that you feel anxious in every new relationship. You think you're just too sensitive, too dramatic, too intense. But none of that is true. You're not too much. You're carrying too many voices that aren't yours. Her voice, her fear, her shame, her need for control disguised as love. It didn't end when you left her home. It just moved inside you. Now you judge yourself with her standards. Now you flinch at your own emotions. Now you mistake caretaking for love and silence for maturity. But here's the truth. You're still reenacting the childhood you never got to complete. The arguments you avoid now mirror the ones you never had the freedom to express. The rejections you chase mirror the attention you were starved of. The numbness you feel in your body is the residue of a child who had to disappear just to be tolerated. And every time you collapse into the old role, the pleaser, the caretaker, the ghost, you reinforce the lie that your needs are dangerous. But they're not. Your needs are not burdens. Your emotions are not threats. Your boundaries are not punishments. They're the parts of you she never let exist. You're not broken. You're haunted. Haunted by an emotional code you never chose, but still live by. But here's the part they don't tell you. Ghosts don't leave on their own. You have to confront them. You have to name them. You have to say, this anxiety isn't mine. This fear of rejection doesn't belong to me. This silence I keep retreating into. It's not who I am. It's who I became to be accepted. Because if you don't name it, you'll keep repeating it, calling it fate, calling it your personality, calling it adulthood. But it's not. It's programming, and you are not a machine. You are not a product of her pain. You are not doomed to live a life shaped by invisible wounds. You were conditioned to forget who you are, and now you have the chance to remember. It does not start with a scream. It starts with a whisper, a single moment of stillness, where something doesn't feel right, not wrong, just unfamiliar, like putting on a jacket and suddenly realizing it was never yours. You hear a thought in your head, don't say that, they won't like it. And for the first time, instead of obeying it, you question it. Wait, who told me that? That's when the crack forms. That's when the programming begins to unravel, because awakening doesn't arrive with clarity. It arrives with confusion, discomfort, silence. You don't feel powerful. You feel disoriented. Everything you thought was you starts to feel artificial. And deep in the silence, you hear it. That thought, it's not mine. That fear of being disliked, that reflex to apologize, that guilt for resting, that need to over-explain, they don't belong to you. They were downloaded, installed, conditioned, and suddenly everything becomes louder. The rules you live by, the roles you played, the people you performed for. You start noticing your own self-betrayal, not because you're failing, but because you're finally seeing it. And that's the beginning of rebellion, not the kind with fists or fire, the kind that happens in private, in silence. You say no for the first time, and your body shakes, not because the boundary is wrong, but because your nervous system was trained to equate truth with danger. You sit with yourself, and it feels like abandonment, because your worth used to come from being needed. You let yourself rest, and it feels like failure, because your value was tied to exhaustion. You speak your mind, and it feels like betrayal, because pleasing her was once your definition of love. This is the paradox of healing. Freedom feels wrong at first, because comfort isn't always truth. Sometimes comfort is the cage, and when you begin to dismantle it, you'll feel exposed, naked, alone. But don't mistake that feeling for a mistake. That's not regression. That's return. Return to the self that was buried beneath years of obedience. Carl Jung called this process individuation. Not becoming someone else, but becoming who you were before the world told you who to be. It's not self-improvement. It's self-recovery. And yes, it's lonely, because most people are still asleep, still wearing masks, still calling their programming personality, still living out their parents' fear and calling it adulthood. But you've stopped pretending, and that makes you dangerous, not to others, but to the illusion, to the systems that run on your silence, to the people who benefit from your self-abandonment, to the roles you were praised for, but never truly loved in. Healing doesn't begin with blame, it begins with awareness. And awareness will burn, It will make you want to go back, to forget, to numb, to return to the comfort of control, but you won't, because something inside you, something buried but not broken, has started to speak, and this time, you're listening. So, no, you're not lost. You're just shedding, not breaking down, waking up. You're not the thoughts you inherited. You're not the roles you played. You're not the fear she handed you like a gift wrapped in guilt. You are what remains when the programming fades. And that person, that's who you've always been. You were not born to be someone's second chance. You were not created to carry her dreams, her wounds, or her silence. You were born whole, untouched, unwritten. And then, you were rewritten, molded, shaped, conditioned into something that fit, into someone that kept the peace, into a version of you that made others comfortable even as you disappeared. But that version, it was a costume, a code, a shadow, and it kept you safe, at the cost of everything real. You learned to smile through pain, to shrink inside praise, to abandon yourself in exchange for attention that never saw you clearly. But now you know, now you see it, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. You realize that voice in your head isn't your intuition, it's her fear. That guilt in your chest isn't your conscience, it's her shame. That perfectionism in your bones isn't your discipline, it's her unmet need for control. You've spent your life trying to become enough, but enough for who? Enough for the version of you she imagined? Enough for a love that came with conditions? You were never hers to sculpt, never hers to shape into a savior. You are not a clone. You are not a projection. You are not her hope, her fear, her regret. You are something far more sacred. You are the part that remained untouched by all the editing, the core, the original, the self that never disappeared, only waited for silence, waited for awareness, waited for you to stop running from your reflection and finally ask, what if I'm not broken? What if I'm just buried? Because the truth is, you were never wrong. You were never too much. You were just surrounded by people who needed you small so they didn't have to grow. And maybe she did her best. Maybe she passed down what she was given. Maybe she never saw you because no one ever saw her. But that cycle ends with you, not through blame, but through becoming the first in the bloodline to stop apologizing for existing, to stop collapsing for peace, to stop inheriting trauma disguised as love. Because when you rise, you don't just heal yourself. You heal everyone who came before you, and everyone who comes after. You become the blueprint she never had, and in that moment, you return to the self you were always meant to be. You are what remains when the programming ends. Not the obedient child, not the fixer, not the mirror, but the one beneath it all. The you who never needed to be anything other than real. That's who you are. And if no one ever told you this before, you are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to be loud. You are allowed to disappoint people who only loved your silence. You don't owe anyone your erasure. You were never hers to create. You were yours all along. If this woke something up in you, something buried but alive, then you're exactly where you need to be. This channel isn't just for watching, it's for remembering. Hit subscribe and keep walking the path back to yourself.